Well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. This is our History of Disaster series. We did one on the Hindenburg recently. Hopefully you saw that episode. If you did not, check it out. I'll put it down in the comments down below and you can check that one out. But probably the most famous disaster in human history was the Titanic disaster. This was a ship that was built to be unsinkable. They had actually crafted it so that many different compartments down below in the ship could be locked off if any area of the ship had been breached and there was water filling in. Those could be locked off and the water would not get to the rest of the ship. So the thought was that the way it was built, along with its sister ship, was that it was unsinkable. And of course, we know that is not true now. Having looked at the history of it, many of us learned about it in school. It hit a very large iceberg, which was disastrous to the Titanic. It created huge gaps in the front right of the Titanic as it grazed that iceberg. The ship then took some time to sink as the ship would fill up over the next couple of hours, eventually break into two, and then both portions of the ship would sink. We had 1,500 souls that died in the Titanic. Fortunately, though, many of them did survive. The ones that were able to get into life rafts and be rescued later were able to survive. But for those that were unable to get off the ship or who dove off the ship and drowned, there was about 1,500 total that died that were passengers and crew. So we're going to get into all the details of the Titanic. Many of us didn't know much about it until the great movie came out in 1997 by James Cameron, titled Titanic. And of course, it's a really excellent movie. If you haven't seen it, highly recommend you check it out. We're going to show some clips of that movie tonight in this program after we go through the history. But let's go ahead and talk about the history of the Titanic disaster. So the Titanic was a British luxury passenger liner that sank on April 14th and 15th of 1912 during its maiden voyage en route to New York City from Southampton, England. It killed about 1,500 passengers and ship personnel. One of the most famous tragedies in modern history. It inspired numerous stories and films. It inspired a musical and has been the subject of much scholarship and scientific speculation. In addition, there have been many dives down to the Titanic shipwreck, which they have found. And there's been lots of documentary films made about the things that they have found at the bottom of the sea when they went to find the Titanic. In terms of the origins and construction of the ship, in the early 1900s, the transatlantic passenger trade was highly profitable. As you might have seen in our episode about the Hindenburg, everybody was trying to solve the transatlantic travel issue. Everybody wanted to go back and forth between Europe and the United States. It was highly profitable and competitive, with ship lines vying to transport wealthy travelers and immigrants. Two of the chief lines were White Star and Cunard. By the summer of 1907, Cunard seemed poised to increase its share of the market with the debut of two new luxury ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which were scheduled to enter service later that year. The two passenger liners were garnering much attention for their expected speed, both with later net speed records crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Looking to answer its rival, White Star chairman J. Bruce Ismay reportedly met with William Peary, who controlled the Belfast shipbuilding firm Harland and Wolff, which constructed most of White Star's vessels. The two men devised a plan to build a class of large liners that would be known for their comfort instead of their speed. It was eventually decided that three vessels would be constructed: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. So three total ships that were going to be part of this plan. In March 31st, 1909, some 3 months after work began on the Olympic, the keel was laid for the Titanic. The two ships were built side by side with each other in the shipyard, in a specially constructed gantry, which would accommodate their unprecedented size side by side. The sister ships were largely designed by Thomas Andrews of Harland and Wolff. In addition to ornate decorations, the Titanic featured an immense first-class dining saloon, 4 elevators, and a swimming pool. Its second-class accommodations were comparable to first-class features on other ships, and its third-class offerings, although modest, were still noted for their relative comfort. As to the safety elements, the Titanic had 16 compartments that included doors which could be closed by the bridge, so that water could be contained in the event the hull was breached. Although they were presumed to be watertight, the bulkheads were not capped at the top. The ship's builders claimed that 4 of the compartments could be flooded without endangering the liner's buoyancy. The system led many to claim that the Titanic was totally unsinkable. Following completion of the hull and main superstructure, the Titanic was launched on May 31, 1911. It then began the fitting out phase as machinery was loaded into the ship and interior work began. After the Olympics maiden voyage in June 1911, slight changes were made to the Titanic's design. In early April 1912, the Titanic underwent its sea trials, after which the ship was declared seaworthy. As it prepared to embark on its maiden voyage, the Titanic was one of the largest and most opulent ships in the world. It had a gross registered tonnage of 46,328 tons, and when fully laden, the ship weighed more than 52,000 tons. The Titanic was approximately 882 feet long and about 92 feet wide at its widest point. On April 12, 1912, the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage, traveling from Southampton, England to New York City. Nicknamed the Millionaire Special, the ship was fittingly captained by Edward J. Smith, who was also known as the Millionaire's Captain because of his popularity with wealthy passengers. Indeed, on board were a number of prominent people, including American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim, British journalist William Thomas Stead, and Macy's department store co-owner Isidore Straus and his wife. In addition, Ismay and Andrews were also traveling on the Titanic. The voyage nearly began with a collision, however, when the suction from the Titanic caused the docked New York to swing into the giant liner's path. After an hour of maneuverings to prevent the accident, the Titanic was underway and out to sea. On the evening of April 10th, the ship stopped at Cherbourg, France. This city's dock was too small to accommodate the Titanic, so passengers had to be ferried to and from the ship in tenders. Among those boarding were John Jacob Astor and his pregnant second wife, Madeline, and Molly Brown. After some 2 hours, the Titanic resumed its journey. On the morning of April 11th, the liner made its last scheduled stop in Europe at Queenstown, Ireland. At approximately 1:30 p.m., the ship set sail for New York City. On board were some 2,200 people, approximately 1,300 of whom were passengers. Throughout much of the voyage, the wireless radio operators of the Titanic, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had been receiving iceberg warnings, most of which were passed along to the bridge. The two men worked for the Marconi Company, and much of their job was relaying passengers' messages. You might have remember from one of our previous episodes, we talked about the Marconi Company and the impact they had on radios all across the world. So very interesting that the two primary radio men on the Titanic that day came from the Marconi Company. On the evening of April 14th, 2 days later, the Titanic began to approach an area known to have icebergs. Smith slightly altered the ship's course to head further south. However, he maintained the ship's speed at some 22 knots. At approximately 9:40 p.m., the Mesaba sent a warning of an ice field coming up. The message was never relayed to the Titanic's bridge. At 10:55 p.m., the nearby Leland liner Californian sent word that it had stopped after becoming surrounded by ice. Phillips, who was handling passenger messages, scolded the Californian for interrupting him. Two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were stationed in the crow's nest in Titanic. Their task was made difficult by the fact the ocean was unusually calm that night because there was little would-be water breaking at its base, and iceberg would be more difficult to spot for these men who were looking. In addition, the crow's nest binoculars were missing. At approximately 11:40 p.m., about 400 nautical miles south of Newfoundland, Canada, an iceberg was sighted, and the bridge was notified. First Officer William Murdoch ordered both the ship hard a starboard and maneuver that under the order ship it was placed would turn the ship to the port or to the left, and the engines to be reversed. The Titanic began to turn, but it was too close to avoid a collision. The ship's starboard side scraped along the iceberg. At least 5 of its supposedly watertight compartments towards the bow were ruptured. After assessing the damage, Andrews determined that as the ship's forward compartments filled with water, its bow would drop deeper into the ocean, causing water from the ruptured compartments to spill over into each succeeding compartment, thereby sealing the ship's fate. The Titanic would founder. And actually, if you remember in the movie, they talked about that. They actually warned the captain and his men that the Titanic was going to founder. It was not going to be It was not going to be unsinkable, as they said. Smith ordered Phillips to begin sending distress signals, one of which reached the Carpathia at approximately 12:20 a.m. on April 15th, and the Cunard ship immediately headed towards the stricken liner. However, the Carpathia was some 58 nautical miles away, and when it received the signal, it would take more than 3 hours to reach the Titanic. Other ships also responded, including the Olympic, but all were too far away. A vessel was spotted nearby, but the Titanic was unable to contact it. The Californian was also in the vicinity, but its wireless had been turned off for the night. As attempts were made to contact nearby vessels, the lifeboats began to be launched, with orders of women and children first to get into the lifeboats. Although the Titanic's number of lifeboats exceeded that required by the British Board of Trade, its 20 boats would carry only 1,178 people, far short of the total number of passengers on board. This problem was exacerbated by lifeboats being launched well below capacity because crewmen worried that the davits would not be able to support the weight of a fully loaded boat. Lifeboat number 7, which was first to leave the Titanic, held only about 27 people, although it had space for 65. In the end, only 705 people would be rescued on lifeboats, way short of the 1,100 total it could have rescued. As passengers waited to enter lifeboats, they were entertained by the Titanic's musicians, who initially played in the first-class lounge before eventually moving to the ship's deck to play. Sources differ on how long they performed, some reporting that it was until shortly before the ship sank. Speculation also surrounded the last song they performed was likely either Autumn or Never My God to Thee. None of the musicians survived the sinking, unfortunately. By 1 a.m., water was seen at the base E-deck of the grand staircase. Amid the growing panic, several male passengers tried to board lifeboat number 14, causing 5th Officer Harold Lowe to fire his gun 3 times and to warn the men to move back. At this time, Phillips' distress calls reflected a growing desperation, as one noted that the ship cannot last much longer. As the Titanic's bow continued to sink, the stern began to rise out of the water, placing incredible strain on the midsection. At about 2 a.m., the stern's propellers were clearly visible above the water, and the only lifeboats that remained on the ship were 3 collapsible boats. Smith released the crew, saying, "It's every man for himself." At approximately 2:18 a.m., the lights on the Titanic went out. It then broke in two, with the bow going underwater. Reports later speculated that it took some 6 minutes for that section, likely traveling at approximately 30 miles per hour, to reach the ocean's bottom. The stern momentarily settled back in the water before rising again, eventually becoming vertical. It briefly remained in position before beginning its final plunge as well. At 2:20 a.m., the ship foundered as the stern also disappeared beneath the Atlantic. Water pressure allegedly caused that section, which had air inside, to implode as it sank. Hundreds of passengers and crew went into the icy water, fearful of being swamped. Those in lifeboats delayed returning to pick up survivors. By the time they rowed back, almost all the people in the water had died from exposure. In the end, more than 1,500 perished. Aside from crew, which had about 700 fatalities, third class suffered the greatest loss of approximately 710 passengers. Only some 174 survived from down below. Subsequent claims that passengers in steerage were prevented from boarding boats, however, were largely dispelled. Given Smith's failure to sound a general alarm, some third-class passengers did not realize the direness of the situation until it was too late. Many women also refused to leave their husbands and sons, while the difficulty of simply navigating the complex Titanic from the lower levels caused some to reach the top deck after most of the lifeboats had already been launched. The Carpathia arrived in the area approximately around 3:30 a.m., more than an hour after the Titanic sank. Lifeboat number 2 was the first to reach the liner. Over the next several hours, Carpathia picked up all the survivors in their boats. White Star Chairman Ismay wrote a message to be sent to the White Star Line offices. Deeply regret to advise Titanic sank this morning, 15th, after collision iceberg, resulting serious loss of life. Further particulars later. At approximately 8:30 a.m., the Californian arrived, having heard the news some 3 hours earlier. Shortly before 9 a.m., the Carpathia headed for New York City, where it arrived to massive crowds on April 18th. Although the majority of the dead were crew members and third-class passengers, many of the era's wealthiest and most prominent families lost some family members. Among them, Isadora and Ida Strauss and John Jacob Astor. In the popular mind, the glamour associated with a ship, its maiden voyage, and its notable passengers magnified the tragedy of this sinking of the Titanic. Legends arose almost immediately about the night's events, those who had died and those who had survived. Heroes and heroines, such as American Molly Brown, who helped command a lifeboat, and Captain Arthur Henry Rostron of the Carpathia, were identified and celebrated by the press as heroes. Others, notably Ismay, who had found space in a lifeboat and survived, were vilified. There was strong desire to explain the disaster, and inquiries into the sinking were held in the United States and Great Britain for over a year. The U.S. investigation, which lasted from April 19th to May 25th, 1912, was led by Senator William Alden Smith. In all, more than 80 people were interviewed. Notable witnesses included Second Officer Charles Lightholder and the most senior officer to survive. He defended the actions of his superiors, especially Captain Smith's refusal to decrease the ship's speed. Many passengers testified to the general confusion on the ship. A general warning was never sounded, causing a number of passengers and even crew members to be unaware of the danger for some time. In addition, because a scheduled lifeboat drill had never been held, the lowering of the boats was often haphazard and very confused. Perhaps the most scrutinized testimony came from the crew of the Californian, who claimed their ship was some 20 nautical miles from the Titanic. Crew members saw a ship, but said it was too small to be the Titanic. They also stated that it was moving and that efforts to contact it by Morse lamp were unsuccessful. After sighting rockets in the distance, the crew informed Captain Stanley Lord, who had retired for the night. Instead of ordering the ship's wireless operator to turn on the radio, Lord instead told the men to continue to use the Morse lamp. By 2 a.m., the nearby ship had reportedly sailed away. In the end, the U.S. investigation faulted the British Board of Trade, to whose lax regulation and hasty inspection the world is largely indebted for this awful fatality. Other contributing causes also were noted, including the failure of Captain Smith to slow Titanic after receiving ice warnings. However, perhaps the strongest criticism was levied at Captain Lord and the Californian. The committee found the ship was nearer the Titanic than 19 miles reported by her captain, and that her officers and crew saw the distress signals of the Titanic and failed to respond to them in accordance with the dictates of humanity, international usage, and requirements of law. In May 1912, the British inquiry began. It was overseen by the British Board of Trade, the same agency that had been derided by U.S. investigators for insufficient lifeboat requirements. The presiding judge was Sir John Charles Bingham, Lord of Mercy. Little new evidence was discovered during the 28 days of testimony. The final report stated that the loss of said ship was due to collision with an iceberg brought about by the excessive speed at which the ship was being navigated. However, Mercy also stated he was not able to blame Captain Smith. He was doing only that which other skilled men would have done in the same position. Captain Lord and the Californian, however, drew sharp rebuke. The British investigators claimed that the liner was some 5 to 10 nautical miles away from the Titanic, and that she might have saved many, if not all, the lives that were lost if she had responded faster. Both the U.S. and British investigations also proposed various safety recommendations. And in 1913, the first International Conference for Safety of Life at Sea was called in London as a reaction. The conference drew up rules requiring that every ship have a lifeboat space for each person embarked, that lifeboat drills be held for each voyage, and because California had not heard distress signals of the Titanic, that ships maintain 24-hour radio watch at all times. The International Ice Patrol was established to warn ships of icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes and to break up ice. Within days of Titanic sinking, talk began of finding the wreck. Given the limits of technology, however, serious attempts were not undertaken until the second half of the 20th century. In August 1985, Robert Ballard, working with Institut François, and he led an expedition from aboard the U.S. Navy ship Connor. The quest was partly a means of testing the Argo, which was a 16-foot submersible sled equipped with remote-controlled camera that could transmit live images to the monitor. The submersible was sent some 13,000 feet to the floor of the Atlantic, sending back images to the Nor. On September 1st, 1985, the first underwater images of the Titanic were recorded as its giant boilers were discovered. Later video showed the ship lying upright in two pieces. While the bow was clearly recognizable, the stern section was severely damaged. Covering the wreckage were rust-colored stalactite-like formations. Scientists later determined that the rusticles, as they were named, were created by iron-eating microorganisms which are consuming the wreck every single day. By 2019, there was a shocking level of deterioration, and the number of notable features, such as the captain's bathtub, were now gone. The Titanic, which is located at 41 degrees 43'57" north, some 13 nautical miles from the position given its distress signals, was explored numerous times by manned and unmanned submersibles over the years. The expeditions found no sign of the long gash previously thought to have been ripped in the ship's hull by the iceberg. The scientists instead discovered that the collision's impact had produced a series of thin gashes, as well as brittle fracturing and separation of seams in the adjacent hull plates, thus allowing water to flood in and sink the ship. In subsequent years, examination of the wreckage as well as paperwork in the builder's archives led to speculation that low-quality steel or weak rivets may have contributed to the Titanic sinking. So you can see really interesting history, both leading up to the Titanic, the way it was built with its sister ship, the concept that it was unsinkable, which of course was not true, the fact that the crew and the captain were driving the ship way too fast. They had been getting warnings all night of iceberg in the area, and they had not taken heed of that. The watchmen who were up top didn't have binoculars. The weather was not very particularly good for seeing icebergs at the time. There was many contributing factors. The Californian that was nearby did not respond fast enough. The iron and steel that had been used to build this ship had been of the cheap variety, which really helped to precipitate this really bad accident. So you can see many things went wrong, and we learned many, many things out of this tragedy, but really fascinating to see what had happened. And also, as you see, the number of people that were rescued, but then later on, the different teams that had gone to try to find the Titanic and eventually found it and got good video coverage. So we will take a look at a quick video now of the actual Titanic sinking itself. What were the contributing factors behind it? We'll also take a look at the end of the program at some clips from the movie Titanic by James Cameron. And then we're also going to look at some footage from the wreck itself that has been taken by some of the submersible vehicles. So that'll be really cool to take a look at. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video. We'll come back and talk about it.
To be a wireless operator on one of these big transatlantic liners, you had to be really good at your job. You had to be really swift at sending and receiving Morse code.
Standing an average of 12 meters high, the bulkheads weren't tall enough to reach the passenger deck level. A deliberate choice by Titanic's
Titanic was first discovered in 1985 by Dr. Robert Ballard and a team of researchers from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and Infirmare, a French institution. We returned to Titanic in 2004 with Dr. Ballard to conduct some further studies and scientific research of the site, compare the information that was first discovered back in 85 and 86 with how the site has changed now. We conducted an updated photo mosaic of the site, researched the rusticles that are growing on the wreck, conducted high-resolution video imagery of the debris field and the site itself, as well as mapped the wreck.
You can see from that video there the 10 major mistakes that the Titanic and their crew made. The first big one was the sister ship of the Titanic, the Olympic, had been in an accident, and it was really avoidable. They had been racing against a U.S. destroyer ship out to sea, and of course ended up bumping into the destroyer ship. Actually, the destroyer ship bumped into the Olympic, creating a hole in the hull, which did fill the one compartment, but did not fill the rest of the ship. And so the Olympic limped back into its port, got fixed, and was actually out to sea 2 weeks later. And so it created this myth of unsinkability, the Titanic being the exact same ship as the Olympic. They were built together. And so it created even more confidence in this myth being solidified in the public, that these ships could not be sunk because the way they had built them and designed them. And of course, that was completely not true. So that was one thing. Then you saw all the other different mistakes that they made that night. The way they were communicating with other ships, the way they were communicating with Newfoundland and other land-based communications, the speed that they were going at, the lookout people didn't have binoculars, the fact that they were in an ice field, according to several other ships that had been radioing them. They had not been taking those messages seriously. Many, many, many mistakes made that night and made on that entire voyage. And so it really was kind of sad to see when you do the post-mortem of this disaster. It really could not only have been avoided, but should have been avoided if people had really been paying attention the way they should have been. In addition, the myth that the Titanic was unsinkable, if they had taken the right precautions and really realized that that really wasn't true, then they would have made sure that they went slower, that they avoided the ice altogether by going further south and taking a little bit longer to get to New York. So all those things are very regrettable. You can see what the people were surprised about on the ship itself. They had no idea this was going on. There was a little bit of a disturbance when they hit the iceberg, and they ended up stopping the ship altogether, and it just sat there. What everybody didn't realize in all the decks up above was that the ship was filling up, and it was filling up very quickly. It was only some of the men that were down in some of the work areas that started to realize that this was a major disaster and problem. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the movie Titanic by James Cameron, give you a little bit of background behind that. And then after that, we'll go look at some clips. A 1997 film. It was an American epic romantic disaster film. It was directed and written and co-produced and co-edited by James Cameron, incorporating both historical and fictionalized aspects of the tragedy. It's based on accounts of the sinking of RMS Titanic in 1912. Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet were the stars and members of different social classes who fall in love during the ship's maiden voyage, the 5-day voyage to New York. The film also features an ensemble cast of Billy Zane, Kathy Bates, Francis Fisher, Bernard Hill, Jonathan Hyde, Danny Nucci, David Warner, and Bill Paxton. So it had a really fantastic cast. Cameron's inspiration for the film came from his fascination with shipwrecks. He felt a love story interspersed with human loss would be essential to convey the emotional impact of the disaster. Production began on September 1st, 1995, when filming the wreck, scale models, computer-generated imagery, and reconstruction of the Titanic built at Baja Studios were all used to recreate the sinking. The film was initially in development at 20th Century Fox, but a mounting budget and being behind schedule resulted in Fox asking Paramount Pictures for financial help. Paramount handled distribution in the United States and in Canada, while Fox released the film internationally. Titanic was the most expensive film ever made at the time, with a production budget of $200 million. Filming took place from July 1996 to March of 1997. Titanic was released on December 19, 1997. It was praised for its visual effects, its acting performances, particularly those of DiCaprio, Winslet, and Gloria Stewart. Production values, direction, score, cinematography, story, and emotional depth were all lauded. Among other awards, it was nominated for 14 Academy Awards and won a record-tying 11, including Best Picture, Best Director, tying Ben-Hur from 1959 with the most Academy Awards won by a film ever. With an initial worldwide gross of over $1.8 billion, Titanic was the first film to reach the billion-dollar mark. It was the highest-grossing film of all time until Cameron's next film, Avatar, in 2009, surpassed it with $2 billion in worldwide sales. A number of re-releases have pushed the film's worldwide theatrical total now to $2.2 billion, making it the second film to gross more than $2 billion. The Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the United States National Film Registry for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant for all time. In terms of the plot of this movie, aboard the research vessel Academic Metzloff, treasure hunter Brock Leavitt and his team explore the wreck of RMS Titanic, hoping to find a necklace known as the Heart of the Ocean. Instead, they discover and recover a safe containing a drawing of a young woman wearing a necklace. The sketch is dated April 14, 1912, the day Titanic struck an iceberg and sank, resulting in 1,500 deaths. After seeing a television report about the discovery, Rose Dawson Calvert contacts Lovett, revealing herself as the woman in the drawing, hoping she can help locate the necklace. Lovett brings Rose and her granddaughter aboard the Kentish, where Rose recounts her experience as a Titanic passenger. In 1912, 17-year-old Rose boards the Titanic in Southampton with her wealthy fiancé, Cal Hockley, and her mother, Ruth. Ruth stresses Rose's marriage to Cal will resolve their financial problems, but Rose is unhappy in the loveless engagement. Feeling trapped, Rose contemplates suicide by jumping from the ship's stern, but is stopped by Jack Dawson, a poor nomadic artist. Jack and Rose form a friendship, and Jack confesses his growing feelings for her. Though initially resistant, Rose realizes she has fallen in love with Jack despite Cal and Ruth's disapproval. Rose brings Jack to her stateroom, asks him to draw her nude, wearing only the necklace. Afterward, they evade Cal's valet, Spicer Lovejoy, and on board the deck, they witness the ship's collision with the iceberg and overhear officers discussing the severity of the situation. When Cal discovers Jack's sketch of Rose and the mocking note she left, he arranges to frame Jack for theft by having Lovejoy plant the necklace on him. Jack gets arrested and locked in the Master of Arms office, while Cal places the necklace in his coat pocket. As the ship begins sinking, women and children are prioritized for the lifeboats. Rose finds and frees Jack from his room, and they return to deck where Cal urges Rose to board the lifeboat, claiming he and Jack will board another lifeboat. He unwittingly wraps his coat containing the necklace around her. However, as her lifeboat is lowered, Rose jumps back onto the sinking ship, unwilling to leave Jack behind. Enraged, Cal grabs a pistol and chases him to the flooding ship, but gives up when they escape. Cal manages to secure a place on a lifeboat by pretending to be a child's father. As the ship's flooded bow sinks, the stern rises in the air and Jack and Rose cling to the railing. The ship splits in two and the stern sinks into the freezing water with remaining passengers. So you can see this incredible movie and the way it was filmed in 1997 by James Cameron and this incredible cast. They really did stick pretty closely to what actually happened on the Titanic, but obviously wove in some fictional plot in different parts of the movie to make it more dramatic and more Hollywoody, I guess you should say. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the clips from the film. So you can see from that dramatic footage there at the end, that's 14 seconds of footage that was actual footage from someone sitting in a lifeboat watching the Titanic as it sank and as its lights eventually went out. And it wasn't long after that before both halves of the ship were at the bottom of the ocean. So, but before that, you can see some really dramatic scenes of the men trying to prevent the ramming of the iceberg after they finally saw it. They were slowing the ship down. They were putting the reverse rudders and reverse engines on. They were trying to turn left. They were doing everything they could to try to prevent this collision, but it did end up eventually scraping the side of the ship, creating huge cracks in the side of the ship. And of course, the ship then started to fill up in the lower decks. So very dramatic footage there you can see from the movie. Really well-made movie. The special effects are fantastic. Highly recommend you see if you haven't. Really gives you a good sense of what this disaster would have been like to actually live it, and what it would have been like in the piece before it happened, and then in the disaster and the survival mode that happened after the collision with the iceberg. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot about the Titanic disaster, what caused it, what led up to it, what happened during it, and then what happened afterwards in both the saving of as many people as possible, 700 people plus that were in the lifeboats got saved, and then, of course, what happened when U.S. and British officials investigated this disaster, tried to find out what were the reasons behind it, and there were many. There were lots of different mistakes made. The steel and iron that was used was not the best, and then, of course, the different decisions made by the captain and crew on the ship, feeling like the Titanic was unsinkable, really gave them a false sense of security, and they did not handle this disaster very well, as you can see. So hopefully you learned a lot and you want to dig a little bit more into the Titanic disaster. Also watch our episode that we just did on the Hindenburg, which is also a really fascinating disaster. Very similar in that they thought the Hindenburg and other like ships, very similar to the Titanic, were kind of impenetrable. And the Hindenburg and the Titanic disasters both really made everybody reassess Atlantic travel and try to find ways to make it more safe for people so that we wouldn't have these type of disasters and deaths. Thank you very much for watching this evening. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of good content your way. Hope you're enjoying the disaster series. We have a couple more coming your way on some of the other biggest disasters in human history. And we'll see you next time on an episode of Traveling Through History. Hope you love history as much as we do. Have a good night.